All right, welcome everybody. My name is Rick, and I'm delighted to see so many people here. When they told me the president would be speaking, I thought, I'm going to have an empty room, but maybe it helped my attendance. Anyway, I'm the CEO of a company called Axon. You used to know us as Taser. And as I thought about, what could I do that might provide some value to the community of police chiefs, I figured let's talk about something that we all are familiar with, and that's controversy. And I've had no shortage of that in my from having launched the Taser. So figured I would share with you some of the things that I see happening now and coming, just to touch on a few examples of some of the more controversial stuff on the horizon, and then what I believe I've learned about it, and maybe we can open up to a little bit of a conversation as well. So that rather than just me presenting, I'd encourage if you have something interesting to say or you think I'm full of it on something, step up to the mic and let's keep it more interesting than, again, just a standard presentation. So the first one is AI, artificial intelligence. And I learned of some of the controversy around this when we acquired 2 teams last year to start unlocking all the information that's locked away in these police cam videos. By the way, maybe a quick background. My company, we do the Taser weapons, we do wearable body cameras, and then we do a cloud software program called evidence.com that manages all that data. We have a bunch of new stuff we've announced, but at least in this context, we were focusing on AI to extract information out of these videos to try to sort of help with the report writing process has been our philosophy. And the day after we announced these acquisitions, the headline was 100% focused on facial recognition. In fact, this was Gizmodo talking about how we were going to empower the Orwellian police state. They were going to put facial recognition everywhere, and there are stories about things coming out of China, et cetera. And we were a little bit taken aback by this. So we ended up, one of the things we did is we said, well, you know what we should do? We formed an AI ethics and privacy advisory board. I'll come back to how that board got formed a little later in the presentation. But the idea was we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful and careful because we got so blindsided by the negative news stories that hit that we decided to bring people into the tent. So we've got the policing project out of NYU and representatives from the Electronic Freedom Foundation and the ACLU and others to come in and sort of show them the things we're thinking about doing so maybe we can anticipate the reactions we would face in the public a little bit better. So we just had our first meeting of the AI Ethics Board this past week. And so I thought I'd go ahead and I'd share with you, because we'd said publicly that Axon was not doing facial recognition, and we wouldn't do it until we'd gotten some advice from our advisory board about how to proceed. So the big update at this point is the feedback from the researchers, both internally and external experts, continue to support that accuracy is not yet sufficient for us to feel comfortable doing facial recognition on body cameras in real time. As we dug into it, where facial recognition is being used, it's typically in limited data sets, like on your phone. Well, there's only so many people who are going to be picking up your phone, and picking up the person who uses it regularly is quite different from picking one person out of a country of 300 million. We saw recently, there were some media stories about them running trials and identifying members of Congress, misidentifying them, et cetera. And although they had set the confidence intervals pretty low in order for that to happen, we have concluded at this point that we still need to wait and let the technology mature. And I'll come back in a few moments to how we think about approaching this. But we are developing a framework at this point for where we see facial recognition fitting in. And the rough framework is going to be around where the places where it can do the most good and the least harm, and where lower accuracy thresholds will be acceptable. And obviously, misidentifying somebody as a potentially violent felon in the moment carries some real risk that things could go sideways. I want to make sure that we at first do no harm. So the way that we're approaching AI, and particularly, well, not just facial recognition, but AI in general, is we think there's a ton of opportunity to first focus in on the non-controversial stuff, like automating workflows. There's a lot of manual things around, like redacting faces out of videos, et cetera. And that's a good place, we think, to take a technology that could be controversial. Let's do the non-controversial stuff first. Get comfortable, get people comfortable that this stuff's getting to the right accuracy levels. Secondarily, we see the opportunity to then take these things and focus on non-real-time applications, things like helping investigators sort through lots and lots of data to identify patterns, but when you still have lots of time for people to review it and make sure, okay, we're not relying on the technology in the moment where it's got to be 100% accurate. And then ultimately, we do see the opportunity to start deploying these technologies in real time, but we think let's not get the cart before the horse. There's a low margin for error when you're doing things in real time. So we think this sequencing, and it could apply to more than just AI. I think just as a general framework, we can all get excited. I got excited about facial recognition and probably said some things that were too enthusiastic early on and ended up eating some of those words where we had to backpedal a bit and say, all right, we're gonna slow down here and make sure that, again, we're doing this carefully. All right, which brings me to a personal area of great passion that has been and will continue to be controversial, and that is the general practice of killing. I think this is an area that most people don't think of as a technology problem or a controversial one, but I think it certainly should be. And it really is, especially when we try to avoid it. So if you look at over the course of human history, we have put a lot of effort into perfecting the technology for killing each other. In fact, many of the ways that we talk about human history are really like we've got the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Nuclear Age. What we're really talking about is the progression of weapons technology over time. So it's been a large part of human endeavor over time, but really I still have yet to find a person who is a fan of killing as an objective, right? It's something we lament, it's something we want to try to avoid, but we sure put a lot of effort into it. So I think that begs an interesting question of why is it that we do kill people? And this is especially fun for me to ask this question in front of a non-group of law enforcement. I was at a tech conference in San Francisco, and I asked for the audience about if they could describe for me when it is that police are trained to shoot to kill. And of course, this is a trick question that they're not trained to shoot to kill, right? Police officers are trained to shoot to stop a threat. Very different concept, but the challenge is that stopping a threat, as I stand here today, still requires the only way you can do it that is the highest reliability and the fastest immediacy is to take a life. It is to kill them. But when people are killed, anytime we read about it, it is always associated with this concept, that I did not have a choice. So we do not elect to kill. It is not a choice that we make. It is a choice that we have to make out of a limited solution set when you have no other option. And so for me, 25 years ago when I first founded the company, that sort of struck me. There was this concept that means it's a technology problem. If we kill because we don't have choices, well, then what choices could we have? And this is the choice of the day, and it still is, and it's been around for several hundred years in different formats. We didn't have them prepackaged. You used to have to muzzle load them. But it's been around for a long time, and I think it's interesting if you think about other problems that we've solved. Medicine and transportation have come a long way in the past several hundred years, and yet the art of conflict resolution still it's gotten a little smaller, maybe a little bit better, but it's still fundamentally the same technology. So when we think about how to stop people, historically it's been a continuum. We start with a little pain, we then move to injury, and if that's not getting the job done, we go to death, right? This is the sort of force continuum, for lack of a better description. So I think there's an interesting fourth opportunity, which is control. If we can take out control. This was part of what led to the taser, by the way. I'm leading into the future here where I think this is going to get controversial, but I figure it's foundational first about how we think about this idea of technology and killing. So if we want to go after control, sorry, hold on a second, let me go back one. Really what we're talking about is, all right, let's do an engineering analysis. How can we take out the command and control center of the body if we don't want to cause pain or injury or death? Well, there's a couple ways you can do this. Chemical is one way to do it. In fact, if you've ever had a surgery, you've experienced chemical incapacitation with anesthesia. We do it with animals with tranquilizer darts. And if you get really aggressive or you overdo it, That's exactly what nerve gas is. Basically, it overstimulates your nervous system such that it shuts down and you can't breathe and your heart doesn't function properly anymore. Although there have also been inhalants that have used. You guys remember the Russian, the Moscow theater incident where they used inhalants. And they had some success, and they also lost some lives in the process. So as I looked at this, chemical just has, frankly, too many challenges. Getting the dose right and how you administer the dose. I mean, when you go in a hospital, they're putting it right in your vein. So when they administer this, it's going right into your bloodstream. Unlike when they tranquilize animals, you're doing it basically right into the muscle tissue, and that takes a few minutes to take effect. And you run into absorption challenges, like if the amount you put into a vein, if you put it into a muscle, you're going to get very different reactions. And enough to do it when you put it in the muscle might be lethal when you put it in the vein, so you get into allergy possibilities and overdose situations. And this is where I became very interested in electricity as a technology. Now this is an image from, it was published in 1972, but I believe the original was taken in the 1940s. There was a researcher at Berkeley named Dalziel who started shocking his students. They volunteer for this test where they would hold on to 2 electrodes, and he would tune up the electricity and see what happened. And what he discovered was this continuum where, and this is a logarithmic scale, meaning it goes from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 milliamperes. And as he tuned it up, at first he didn't feel anything, then it would start to tingle, and then as he cranked it up, he got to this point where it became painful, and then there was this point where the subjects could no longer let go. What was happening is their muscles were locking up around the electrode, and he called that the let go threshold because they couldn't let go anymore. Now, he did not keep going and kill his students, but he did go back and refer to animal studies and others and was able to plot that the difference between the area where they could no longer let go and where it would stop the heart is about a 10-to-1 safety margin. And so ultimately, this is what made for a very interesting technology when we think about if we want to stop someone without killing them, electricity all of a sudden has this really interesting attribute, the immediacy of the effect, and yet it's reversible and it's got a high safety margin. Now, when we talk about controversy, one of the things I discovered is you got to be careful how you sell this stuff, because we got pretty roundly criticized for overstating the safety margins. We're pretty enthusiastic about how safe it is, and to this day I believe it's a very safe technology, but which we didn't anticipate was no matter how safe the technology is, you're going to have some bad outcomes. And the threshold, in fact, there's been a whole debate about the term non-lethal and less lethal, right? The military started, the term of art back in the late 80s and early 90s was non-lethal. That's what the military still uses to this day. But then anytime there was a negative outcome, including with pepper sprays, and other pepper sprays also got an amazing safety margin. But occasionally there's deaths. Now, most of the time there's a death with pepper spray. Pepper spray has nothing to do with it. It's usually related to other issues, usually drug related. However, what agencies found in the court of public opinion, there was this massive debate about non-lethal. Like, it was interpreted as almost a promise that nothing bad would happen. Non-lethal means nobody ever dies. So the US military adopted a new definition of non-lethal where they were very prescriptive in saying that is the intention, but we cannot guarantee the outcome. Whereas we saw in law enforcement the shift to less lethal. So that when we articulate this in the courts and in the court of public opinion, we're careful not to oversell the safety capabilities and what to expect when these things are used. So being non-lethal, they're now less lethal. So electrical technologies had some really, and continue to have, these really interesting properties of having a high safety margin, immediate effect, a big, the dosing can be controlled because it's electronics, right? You can do dose control very easily, and a high level of effectiveness. In fact, this, I'll play that one more time. This is the commander of the SWAT team in Prague. And when we first launched the M26, where we finally solved the effectiveness problem, I had had a humiliating day in Prague in the 1990s. I went in with an earlier generation of taser, and I had 8 cadets in a row who all walked right through it, and I got thrown out of there like a snake oil salesman. So when we finally figured out how to make the electrical effects more effective, I felt like MacArthur with my corncob pipe going back to Prague. And we said, we don't want cadets this time. Give us who is the badass in the room, right? So they gave us the leader of the SWAT team, and we hooked him up, and we disconnected. Obviously, it was an unarmed weapon. We triple-checked that it was unloaded. And then our chief instructor hit him, and he said, try to pull the trigger. And we actually found we could lock him up before, even though he already had the weapon pointed, and we had his finger out of the trigger guard, because we knew if it was in there, it might have contracted it. But he was not able to even perform the task of putting his finger on the trigger. Now, I only show you this, that we see visibility to where this technology can be more effective even than a bullet. Bullet, traditionally, I mean, to stop you, unless you hit somebody in the central nervous system, you're waiting for them to bleed out or to suffer from the trauma. So there's actually can be a real variability in time to effect. However, the reliability is not there yet. So this has also been something we've been very careful in our training to caution on expectations. You do not take a taser to a gunfight, a non-lethal weapon to a gunfight. And we just launched a new taser this week, and I want to reiterate, as much as this improves performance, you should come by our booth and shoot one. It's really awesome. It's a huge step forward. You still wouldn't take it to a gunfight. It's still not as reliable as it will need to be. But the reason I'm talking about this here is not just to, talk about what we've done. In the next 10 years, we're talking about controversies coming at us. We believe in the next 10 years that we're going to see non-lethal weapons take that next step to where they actually surpass the reliability of firearms, at least for pistol. Long range is a little harder, might take longer than 10 years. I think this is going to be an interesting day when this happens. Because ultimately, we believe the objective is you can't ask the officer to put their life on the line to try to save the other person. First objective has got to be self-preservation. But what happens when actually the thing that kills the other guy is not as reliably effective and fast as the thing that doesn't kill the other person? So the way we're thinking about this is when we hit that threshold, it's going to take decades, right, for the proof to come in the pudding. But the main thing that we're seeing coming next is this idea that when officers are going into situations of uncertainty, when you're going into a house and you don't know what's in the house today, you have a gun in your hand. That's a rough position to be in as a human being, to have to make a life or death decision in a fast-moving situation, potentially in the dark, when you don't know what's coming at you. So we would like to get to a point where non-lethals are so good that they're moving up to where in situations of uncertainty, and still with lethal cover, but they're being deployed. And we know there's a higher reliability threshold that's got to be hit. So we're on Taser 7 today, so I've set the goal by Taser 9. Give us 2 more revs, and we'll get there. But it's going to raise some really interesting questions, especially in a gun culture in the United States, how we think about this. And then we're also thinking about how this resonates in non-gun culture. So I actually think this will probably take hold first in Europe and Asia, where there's much less prevalence of firearms in the hands of the public. But we'll see how that rolls out. So I've started to recently talk about our objective as a company is to make the bullet obsolete, this idea of ending the practice of killing. But if killing is a technology problem and we can solve the technology problem, then we could get to a point where the idea of killing is actually becoming outdated and arcane. And at first this sounds pretty damn egotistical, right? Like well, we're going to be the ones to do this? And then recently I was reading a book by Steven Pinker out of Harvard. It's a fantastic, interesting book, by the way, called Better Angel of Our Nature. And he looks at the declines in violence throughout human history. It actually turns out we are just one player in a trend that's been happening for hundreds of years. So this actually looks at warfare, deaths from battle warfare, or deaths in battle from the mid-1940s. So this actually starts, I believe, at the tail end of World War II. And you can see a pretty dramatic downward trend line. I mean, one example of this is actually what we see today. My son served in Afghanistan, and it was terrifying as a parent. And we have friends who've lost family members in Afghanistan and Iraq. That being said, the number of people we've lost in the last 15 years in the Middle East was not a bad day in World War II or World War I in terms of the sheer volume of loss of life. It's still tragic and scary for parents, so I don't mean to minimize it, but we are seeing this dramatic downward trend. Well, this is warfare. When we think about public safety, let's talk about homicide rates. And this goes back to, it's a little hard to see, but I think the 1300s in Europe. And when you look at it over a multi-hundred-year time period, super interesting. In fact, the probability of dying in a homicide is down by over 500-fold. You used to have about a 15% chance of death in medieval Europe, whereas today it's a fraction of 1%, pretty much anywhere across the globe. So I find this a really exciting and interesting thing because for most people, if you ask them, do you think the world's getting better or not? Many people say, oh my gosh, it's a scary time to be alive. There's all this conflict. I see all this nasty stuff on the news. It's a dangerous world. Fact is, objectively, no, it's not. I mean, up until a couple hundred years ago, every society on Earth had ritualistic killings. We had the Inquisition in Europe. We had the Salem witch burnings here in the US. And you had basically across the entire world gruesome capital punishments for all sorts of minor infractions. I was just reading some of them were even things like children or people talking back, right, to the ruling class could be capital punishment. So we've come a long way, and I'm really excited to see where we take this next. But at the core of this phenomenon is the public safety function. Because basically before public safety, before government basically stepped in and provided a structure for handling disputes between people, it was the honor code, which was effectively really taking in your own hands, street justice. All right, so things are trending in an interesting direction. Where does it go next? So we see handheld weapons trending away from lethality. So there's another interesting space. Armed robots, super interesting and controversial. Many tech leaders have come out against this idea. We certainly don't want autonomous lethal systems. Nobody wants the Terminator that's going to come out and make autonomous decisions to kill people. But we have lots of armed robots, drones in the Middle East already, but under human control, which is a very important distinction. And in fact, this next video, this is not from my company, by the way. But anybody see this video? It was like 2 years ago on YouTube. I believe this is at the conference South by Southwest. We had some folks who took a drone and put a taser weapon on it. Now, 80,000 volts of awesomeness is probably not how I would think you'd want to introduce this concept. And this was, I think, front page of the Wall Street Journal as well when it happened. It was, pretty scary stuff. At least to the public, pretty scary stuff. Right? Because we immediately envision this idea of who wants drones flying around their neighborhood armed to swoop down and tase people at random. Well, I think if we reframe it though, under other circumstances, let's say you were an events team at the Mandalay Bay last summer. Would it be valuable to have a small aerial vehicle that if shots are being fired from a high location, instead of taking 10, 15 minutes to try and find the building and get up to where the threat is, an operable drone, and I think there's a big threshold between lethal and non-lethally armed, to be able to go after a threat could save a lot of lives. So just to be clear, this is not something that we're working on yet, but when I look out over the horizon, if you also think about the whole idea of conflict or a violent conflict between two people, part of the exigency for lethal force tends to happen when we're close to each other, right? It gives the operator a lot less time to make a decision, and frankly, the preservation of self kicks in. I mean, we had the shooting in Florida where we had the mass shooter and we had an armed deputy, right, that was on premise and ultimately didn't go in that case. By the way, I'm not making any judgment calls. I don't have any of the details of what happened. But I know the idea, even for a human being to go in when you're armed with a pistol against somebody armed with an assault weapon is a lot to ask. So I think we are going to start to see, and we saw it happen in Dallas, right? Anybody here from Dallas PD? When they were dealing with the shooter, that they had finally gotten him in I believe, in a parking garage, and there was no way to approach safely. They sent in an armed robot, in this case, with a lethal explosive device on it. Certainly, we're starting to see these things are being developed and deployed. You know, we're hearing about drones being used potentially for nefarious purposes with all sorts of things to be flown into public areas. We're going to have to think about how to stop those. But I do think in the next 10 years, there's going to be a place for long-distance, automated systems with some sort of armed response. Basically, I think non-lethally armed drones, whether it's with electricity or pepper spray, or even lethally armed like we saw in Dallas, is going to be something that's it's going to certainly become highly technically feasible, and it's going to be incumbent on us to figure out where is it publicly acceptable and where is it, in fact, something that's superior to the options we have today. So to think of it a different way, I showed you my original picture of the robots was the killer, right? The killer robots that we all don't want. But I think when we start thinking about robotic systems, you know, you can reframe it a little differently, where a robot can take a lot of risk, or a drone can take a lot of risk that you would never ask a person to do, right? You send an officer in to deal with somebody who's armed, you're not going to ask that officer to risk getting shot. So their need to preserve their own life escalates the need to potentially deploy lethal force. When we can remove the operator a distance from the threat, it opens up a whole range of options in time and space to be able to deal with that threat that we may not have if we put a human being right into that situation. It can actually force an escalation that we otherwise might be able to avoid. So I don't have the answers yet about how this is going to unfold. We're just starting to wrap our heads around it. And for any of you that are interested in exploring this space, I'd love to talk to you after the fact. I'll give you my email, or you can come by the booth. We get this is a really tricky area to even think about, but it's one that's important. So I think there's this new concept, or for me, this concept that we tend to focus on the new versus what we have today. And actually, the exercise we did with our AI ethics and privacy board was pretty fun. So we had a dinner the night before we met with all these police accountability type experts. And for homework, I asked everybody to watch Minority Report. And we had a dinner conversation about Minority Report. And it was pretty fun because Minority Report is one of those negative things you see in the news media, right? Like, oh my gosh, predictive policing, it's like Minority Report. And everybody says it like it's a terrible thing. Well, so I went back and we watched the movie, and objectively, you guys remember Minority Report? So what happens in Minority Report, just as a quick refresher, they have this kind of weird technology. There are these people that have a special capability to see the future. But let's wipe the technology out. Anyway, the technology takes the murder rate from very high to zero with extremely high reliability because they're able to intercede beforehand. So society gets dramatically safer, and then at the end of the movie, they discovered that the people who built the technology, one of them was in fact, you know, somebody who'd killed somebody, and he was able to game the system so he didn't get caught. And they ended up shutting it down in the movie. Of course, everybody who's watching the movie was like, yeah, they shut it down. This is terrible. This is a tragedy. Because this one person was able to game the system. Well, as we talked about it over dinner, one of the advisors had an interesting quote from Joseph Stalin that, you know, one person dead is a tragedy. 100,000 people dead is a statistic. And I think we've seen that. And we see it in other areas like driverless cars. Arizona, our state, wanted to attract the driverless car research industry to Arizona. So they changed the laws to make it friendlier. And about 3 or 4 months ago, we had the first fatality in an autonomous vehicle accident. How many people here saw that in the news, the Uber car that killed somebody, right? It got a ton of focus. Meanwhile, I think in Arizona, we've had like 500 to 800 traffic deaths so far this year. Anybody see any of those in the news? Right? So you don't want to minimize that this was certainly a tragedy for the group involved, but sometimes we get overly focused on the new thing is scary, but we don't compare it to what we have now. So going back to Minority Report, would we want to shut down a system that had one flaw from the person that designed it was able to game the system if it was actually 99% accurate? What do you think the accuracy is in our conviction rate in the criminal courts today? Anybody think it's north of 99%? Right? I mean, we live in a world full of imperfections, and as we think about, and again, I've experienced this with when we launched tasers, that even when something is a dramatic improvement versus the status quo sort of gets a pass because it's just the way the world is. And the new thing gets a ton of scrutiny. Now, that's not a reason to stop working on this stuff. It's just something we need to think about as we roll these new technologies out, that we're going to be held to an extremely high standard. But I think this whole idea of Minority Report being a bad thing doesn't pass intellectual muster. And some of the new technologies that are being rolled out, predictive policing, I think in general is getting a lot of negativity in the news media. But if you think about, I think of it as data-driven policing or evidence-based policing. Because if we're not allocating our resources based on some analysis of data, then we're just doing it on either gut feel or randomness. I think we're much better to be using data than to just keep doing it the way we had without any data systems to drive those resourcing decisions. I'll skip this one. Well, I guess I'll go back. When we think about, deploying autonomous systems, even in military settings, right, we kind of forget how horrific the tools, 500-pound bombs being dropped from the sky, are pretty awful. And if we could develop more autonomous systems that are more precision and targeted, it may harm our sensibilities at first, but ultimately, I think a lot of opportunity to save a lot of lives if we can not go for perfection, but just go better. All right, so what are the things that I think about, having gone through a number of these cycles ourselves with the facial recognition issue or with the original launch of TASER from many years ago? I think there's a couple overriding principles that as we roll out a technology that is going to be controversial, is number one, oversight is pretty critical. When we launched the first TASER M26, do we have anybody from Baltimore in the room? Are you with oh, from Baltimore, okay. I remember the M26 TASER, I presented it in Baltimore. It was one of my first sales presentations. And the folks at Baltimore PD said, this is great, but we'll never deploy it. And I said, well, geez, why not? You give your people guns, why would you not use this? And they said, well, we had an incident where officers drove past a street corner, and they didn't like the people that were there, and they dispersed them with some pepper spray out the window of the patrol car. And so hearing that, we came back, and actually in the moment, I think we did some brainstorming and said, okay, how would we solve that? And that feedback is what led to us putting the data port in the TASER that records the usage patterns. So rather than just saying, okay, this is not something that you would use, what if we put more oversight on it? And that's actually been very helpful. It didn't stop all the problems with TASER, but putting that level of oversight in gave us some more solid answers. So anytime we've heard these feedback, we typically think about what can we do to address that feedback. And oversight is time and time again, it's a big one. And in fact, when I talked about our Artificial Intelligence Advisory Board, here's where that idea came from. Right after we had all these news stories hit that we were not expecting about facial recognition, I was interviewing Regina Dugan. She used to run DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and then she went to Facebook and Google and led some of their advanced teams. And she was sharing with me one of the learnings from the Human Genome Project. So let me backtrack for a second. The Human Genome Project was launched in the 1990s, where the federal government put up $3 billion to read the full DNA of one human being. And this was, number one, a very controversial thing to do at the time and technically extremely difficult. And the reason it was controversial, I mean, imagine what people were saying you could do once you really understood the human genome. Designer babies, do people have abortions if the fetus if the amniotic fluid is tested, they're not going to have blue eyes. I mean, there's all sorts of nightmare scenarios about designer babies, and are we going to start engineering people, et cetera. Like the sort of Nazi eugenics things started coming up. So what the federal government did was they impaneled a separate, what they called the Ethical, Legal, and Science Implications Board to oversee the Human Genome Project. So rather than having no answer, when you get people bringing up, well, here's terrible thing 1, 2, and 3 that could happen, having an independent oversight board at least gave a solid answer and gave people a lot more comfort that, oh, okay, there's going to be some oversight as to how this technology will be used. And I mean, thank goodness they did it, right? I mean, the most promising areas in cancer research are all direct descendants from the Human Genome Project. In fact, my personal belief, I think we're going to see cancer in the next 10 years, the vast majority of them will likely be solved because of what came out, because cancers are genetic anomalies that happen. And we now are getting the ability, if you get a cancer today, chances are they will sequence the DNA from the tumor and from your body and then look at what changed. And there's a whole bunch of companies working on the targeted drugs to go after the mutations and just take out the tumors. Never would have gotten there if that program had been stopped. So we think of that in terms of, we created this AI ethics board, I think, for agencies as well. Really thinking through that oversight piece is important. The next is maintaining human judgment. And there's a lot of concern, and in some cases justified, about turning over the decision-making authority to technology that's as yet unproven. I mean, this comes down to, particularly when we start talking about lethally armed things like drones, that they retain an oversight where the call is being made by a human. I think that's important across the board. Similarly, when we start talking about things like facial recognition, before you act on that, you're going to want to continue to have very strong human oversight to make sure that the technology isn't driving operational decision making. That should still retain with human beings. Security and privacy across entities are really big issues. I'm sure you've all heard of some of the more recent data hacks that have been happening. But any new technology, particularly if it starts amalgamating data, becomes a real challenge for how do you protect that data and the privacy of all the people that are affected. And with this, audit capabilities, usage control. So when we're thinking about facial recognition technology or license plate reader technology, I've seen some very powerful demos for where you can go in and you can run searches on people and see a pretty eerie level of detail into where this person lives, works, where they hang out, who they're associated with, et cetera. It seemed to me that we want to put some real thought into how we're logging who's running those searches and how we're controlling, just like we do in other areas of policing. And I just bring this up because one of the searches I saw, I was interested to see the person running it. I was like, why are you showing me this? Like, this is kind of strange. It doesn't feel like it had the right levels of control in place. Now, speaking of this, there's times, you've probably heard Tim Cook from Apple say, if the product's free, you're the product. Or this idea of free services. The reason a lot of companies give away free services is to make use of the data that come out of those services. So when we think about privacy and data security, you want to be careful whenever you hear free. And you're hearing this from a guy who this week just announced that we're doing free. We're doing free records management for people who deploy our new body cameras and taser weapons. So you should be a little skeptical when you hear me say it's free. And you should wonder, okay, why is it free? So in our case, obviously I'm going to be very transparent about this or I wouldn't be bringing it up. The reason we're doing a free records management system is because we believe the real value will come when we can create AI tools that will create the reports from the video. In order to do that, we need lots and lots of reports. And so we can train the video, the transcription tools, how to extract and annotate the report fields from the video. It's called training data. Now in this case, we're able to do this because we have a secure CGIS training center where people that are fingerprint cleared that can help with the training between the video and the report data. Other than that, we don't have any, well, even with that, we don't retain any right, title, or interest in the agency's data. The partners that are participating are merely allowing the systems to use their data to train the algorithms to be able to extract the transcription into the report. Be happy to talk with any of you in more detail. My purpose is not to get up here and like pat ourselves on the back for how we're approaching this, but to put a bug in your ear that you should be, you want to understand from your technology partners, what is their incentive structure and how much. There are some data businesses here where the vendor actually retains ownership in the data. Not to say you won't ever enter into those relationships, you just want to be really cognizant when it's happening. You want to know it's happening and not find out on the front page of your local newspaper later. Which brings me to one of my last points here, that when you're thinking about any of these technologies, obviously you want to think very carefully and do a lot of homework on the teams that you're partnering up with, because there's guys like me that are going to stand up here, and obviously every one of us is going to tell you how great our stuff is. Your job is to pressure test that. And I actually think this is a really good analogy for law enforcement, because a lot of people come up in law enforcement, technology is not your sweet spot, or you'd be working at Facebook or Google or at Axon if you wanted to make a career in technology. You made a career in law enforcement, which is hard enough on its own. And so as we're seeing this shift to a world of cloud where you're using your vendors not just to sell you stuff that your people build and operate, you're actually signing up with vendors who are then providing the entire solution. They're operating the system for you. And I think there's a little bit of a shift in mindset that occurs, and you can leverage this to your advantage. Right? Your internal team should be moving from people that are building and plugging things in, like instead of them building solutions, you want them actually having a highly skeptical and critical eye of what those solutions are becoming. It's a different skill set, but as the world's becoming more connected and vendors are playing a greater role in delivering the technology, the types of skills you need, it's not like you're not going to need technical people. You absolutely are, but you're really needing people that have a deeper skill set and being able to go in and pressure test all of your different technology providers. Because it's going to be harder and harder. There's fewer and fewer agencies that can afford to run all of their own systems. So when you're partnering with providers, you really need to have not just the skill set of people that can build the stuff, but people that can do security audits and that can go very deep on the data privacy and those other issues. So you want to be the Siskel and Ebert. By the way, there is an advantage here as well. It's sort of crass to say it, but your own kids are never ugly, right? The stuff you build internally, there's all the institutional ownership issues, right? The people that are building it, it's much harder to be critical of your own stuff. So the advantage when you are using outside vendors, it's a lot easier to be a critic, and I'd encourage you double down on that. That's a good instinct, because it also gives you the ability to play up. If you make a mistake with vendor A, you obviously want to know going into it that you're using open standard type stuff that you can switch to vendor B, but that's a lot easier than firing a bunch of people who don't have the right skills because you need to move from technology stack A to technology stack B. So anyway, point being, is in this fast-moving world, it's becoming more and more important to have the right skills to test your vendors, and that plays right into your sweet spot. I suspect there's some people in your agencies that are pretty good at reading people, and that's what a lot of this is coming down to, assessing who are the right people to deliver the technology, and then hiring the right folks to keep pressure testing those. So with that, my last point would be on any of these newer technologies, our experience is that being transparent and proactive makes a big difference. Earlier this year, there have been a number of stories about agencies using facial recognition where the public didn't know about it and they found out about it through an investigative report. Totally different dynamic, isn't it? When it's a gotcha moment where just the entire perception starts from a position of distrust and negativity, that some investigative reporter found out you're doing something, everywhere you can, I would advocate if you can do a press education and a media event and meeting with your local community groups before something controversial is rolled out, it has the opportunity to at least change the tone. Maybe there's times you can't, but we've definitely seen you are not going to be able to do stuff in secret for very long. It's going to end up in the public, and you can at least control the trajectory of how it enters into the public discourse. So I encourage, we all need to be thoughtful. Our company, one thing that we're proud of is I enjoy doing controversial things that matter. Because I think there's a lot of companies that can't do it. A lot of the big tech players could never build something as controversial as a taser because just the nature of a large organization, they can't take that sort of risk. We enjoy taking those risks to move the ball down the field, but we also know, this stuff, anytime you're driving change, there's a lot of risk involved. So we try to be thoughtful about it. We encourage you as well to be thoughtful, and I'm certainly open to input. If there's anything you disagreed with from up here, I'd want you to call me on it. And with that, let me open it up. I'd love to get a little bit of interaction. That's my last slide. My email is rick@axon.com. I'd certainly love to get feedback. So curious, any comments or questions, or do you disagree with any things I've put up here, or any major issues around how to handle a controversy that I didn't touch on? Yes, sir.
Agree with everything that you've done at Taser International and Axon. Appreciate what you have done for law enforcement. What in the near term, next year or two, do you see that you are going to be introducing?
Interesting. So the question, for those of you who couldn't hear from the back, is any new things that we're introducing? Well, we just did it this week. On Saturday night, I had a bunch of big announcements. So, a new taser, a new connected body cam, and free RMS for the next 5 years. Which, again, that's why I wanted to touch on, anytime you hear free, include, even those of you who know me well, you should still pressure test, okay. Because look, we got to keep the lights on. Vendors, we're not running nonprofits. There's usually some monetization model there. And if they're going to monetize your data, you want to understand how they're going to do it to make sure you're comfortable with it. So those are our big three. And then you'll have to stay tuned for next year till we announce more stuff. Let's see. Right here, sir.
With respect to changing from a handgun to something else that would replace it, I can see it making sense to a point, but do you have the idea how you're going to fix the issue of distance and number of rounds available to shoot? There's a vast disparity there between what somebody can hold for 4 magazines,
Yep.
handgun, and obviously the distance restrictions.
Yeah, so the question was, do I know how we're going to deal with distance and multi-shot capability? Yes. And to be clear, I don't want to oversell. I think this is going to take decades. I think technically we can get to something that statistically will meet that threshold within the next 10 years. But then I think it's a couple decades. And I am not suggesting it. And I'm very conscious. We do not want to be seen as ones out there promoting that cops shouldn't wear guns anymore. Bad idea. We're just saying over the long haul, we want to give you something that gets to the point where your lethal force is collecting a lot of dust. And after that's happened for a few decades, then maybe we talk about, okay, what equipment makes sense. But we want to be very careful not to back you into a corner. And frankly, that happened a little bit early on. You guys may recall when we launched the M26, our ad campaign was as close to 100% as it gets. Well, we learned overselling that. We had some officers get hurt that were taking tasers in where they shouldn't. We had to go back and revamp a lot of our training and messaging to make sure we don't let our enthusiasm get ahead of ourselves and get some people hurt in the process. Let's go back there.
This technology, it's a pretty complicated area. You've got computer, dispatch, you've got property, you've got evidence. There's a lot of different models there, conditions, records, management. And ideally, the systems, they should all talk to each other. What is your plan to integrate
So the question was about our plans to integrate the law enforcement back end is quite complex. So this morning I was at a board meeting, and now I'm going to vapor lock and get the name of the group wrong. And that actually just happened. Anyways, there's a new organization that's being stood up. I was at a board meeting this morning between industry and law enforcement to promote open standards, where effectively, I think what should happen, that integration, as we move to a more internet-connected world, look, no one vendor is going to own it all, and they're delusional if they think they are. But this new organization, and I'll look it up in a moment here. Actually, let me just do that now because it's on my calendar. It was the Police Standards and Technology Association. And the idea is that no single vendor is going to be able to do this. So you want to look for vendors that play nice with each other. And frankly, those that the PSTA is going to be doing certifications of different technology providers. So they're creating working groups to create standards with both law enforcement and technology representation. And then they'll actually be testing and giving a sort of a certification seal to technology solutions that meet the PSTA standards. I think that's going to be a huge, huge move forward. Because frankly, historically, there's been a lot of incentive for providers to try to lock in their business model to try to avoid over competition. And so systems there is a bit of an adverse incentive where technology providers might have an incentive not to play as well. And I think this was going to help to level the playing field. And ultimately what should happen, the technology providers, if they're using the right architectures, they should be providing integrations that are turnkey in the background so that, in 5 years or so, you shouldn't have to have your staff plugging in systems, getting them to play well with each other. That really should be something that the vendors are sorting out technically between themselves. So that, it's just not a great use of agency resources to have to, play referee between your vendors. Let's come up here and then we'll come back.
As you move toward a system where you're looking at machine learning, et cetera, are all of your data centers in the U.S. international concern?
Yeah, so good question was around, are all of our data centers in the US and how we're managing data sovereignty. So for the solution that we're running in the US, we're in Microsoft's GovCloud infrastructure. So those are all in the US. I get similar questions from some of our international customers about, where those are. So we do have, we're typically running on Azure. We do have some AWS instances in some parts of the world as well. So if you're from, I can give you details if you're from another jurisdiction. It's interesting challenges. All right, one more question, then we'll wrap. Right here, sir.
So as technology keeps developing, as an industry that develops technology, there's always this lag time between technology advancements and law. And we're always caught in the middle oftentimes in, do we put in the technology and then what's the legal standing for our industry? And how do you see that gap being closed so it's not so prominent?
Just so people in the back can hear, the question was, how do we see the gap? Technology is moving at a certain speed and legislation is moving at a, shall we say, a slower speed. And how do we think about that? I actually had this question from a financial analyst, and my answer was, it's a briar patch, and we kind of like being Briar Rabbit. So when we launched body cameras, there were, I think, 8 states that did not allow body cameras. And we've gone back and worked with law enforcement to get those laws changed. So as depressing as the polarization in Washington can be, the optimism, or the good news is we've seen state legislatures are generally pretty good about updating things that, nobody's in favor of police being inefficient, or in this case, like not being able to use body cams to increase transparency. So we try to look for things where there's an obvious incentive, like for artificial intelligence, nobody is against automating the creation of police reports. It may be very polarized about using AI to screen people's faces without their consent. But in some of these other areas, we try to find the things that are non-controversial, and then we enjoy going after those because it's frankly rewarding to see when you can change the laws and the technology together. But it's not easy. But that's part of, again, what makes this a unique and interesting industry to be in, because that is definitely part of the problem. The legal framework's got to move over time with the technology. I guess the other thing I would say is it is nice it's having 50 different states, because we can usually find some states where we can begin to get traction and then get case studies in those states and then use those. That's how body cameras shifted in states like Pennsylvania. We had case studies from elsewhere that we could then share, and that would help create the momentum. Much harder to do internationally, where you tend to have national level restrictions. Those are a lot harder to change, and then you can't get a case study, because it's one umbrella that you have to change before you have data. All right, well, thanks. I really appreciate you guys coming out and spending time. I'll hang out for a little bit.